So now I have a question for Carolyn Dinshaw. And so your work has brought out complications of temporality, both medieval and modern, calling for queer connections across time. And what I wondered if you could talk about was maybe why you feel temporality has become a foundational concept in queer studies. There was a period where it was, the foundational. Now there's some other things, but why you think it's so important? Do you think queer temporality stands in contrast to the time of historical writing? How do you feel queer critiques of linear time and queer approaches to nonlinear temporality should engage with linear mandates that are placed on raced and colonized people? Ta-da. Take it away.
Thank you. It's great to be here, and I just echo the sentiments of Anjali and Omnia in thanking Zohar and Durba and Brenda as well, and you all for coming. Okay, so how did time become a thing in queer theory? These are just some gestural thoughts, really, and they're really based on my own experience writing in feminist gender studies, queer theory. I think, for me at least, the problematics of writing history are produce the focus on time. The question of how to write histories of sexualities became so urgent, at least in the U.S. after in gay liberation and after gay liberation, and it devolved into the controversies that some of us will recall between essentialism and social constructionism. Remember that? And asymmetrical haircuts in the 80s.
Those are back.
Yeah. So throughout that debate, I myself felt that as someone who was working on a pre-modern culture, and yet feeling very much a sense that of relatedness to issues and ideas emerging from that culture, I felt that there was a need to account for differences and similarities across time. So that was under the pressure of the problems of how to write history, I started thinking in terms prompted not only by, say, Walter Benjamin in the thesis on the philosophy of history, and his amazing image of the constellation of stars that emit light that we see. The light is emitted at different times, but we see them all together in a constellation. And so that was his image for how different periods of time can gain salience in relation to other periods, separated perhaps across many eras. So Benjamin was one influence on my thinking, but and as Omnia alluded to, so was post-colonial theory, and especially the subaltern studies group, Dipesh Chakrabarti in particular, from my own work, in his theorizing about archives that resist historicization. So in his thinking, that even historians who are very attuned to the impact of linguistic indeterminacy, historical contingency, situatedness of knowledge, claims, and knowers, will nonetheless be operating via a sense that everything can be placed somewhere on a timeline that is naturalized time, uncontingent and a priori. and continuously flowing. So his point was to draw attention to this so that we could try to think about things that are just not going to be placed or resist that kind of temporalizing. And for him, it was the force of gods and spirits in historical causality. So I think for me, at least, the problematics sent me to thinking about time and sent me into non-Western traditions as well. I have to admit also that just thinking about my own background, my own childhood home, had a lot to do with my thinking through these issues. I started to think more about my own father and his backwardness. My father is Indian. He's Parsi, or at least was born Parsi, came to the United States to get his MBA at UC Berkeley right after partition, met my mother, who is from LA, and moved to San Jose, California, where I was born and raised. So I wanted to think about the role of his backwardness, that is, his relation to this place that he always put behind him in his quest for the MBA, for modernity. He worked at IBM for his entire career. And I had this sense that at one and the same time, he was very modern, and yet he had these ongoing connections to a past that was characterized as non-modern. My own sense of thinking about how sexuality entered into this was that my sense was that my way of picking up and living out that otherness in the household was through sexuality. And so race and racialization and sexuality sort of grew hand in hand, or went hand in hand. And all became part of a now that was quite temporally heterogeneous. Okay, so the other thing that was operant in my childhood home, this is a lot of autobiography, I realize, despite our formal surroundings. But the other thing that was operant was Christianity. My father converted from the ancient religion of Zoroastrianism practiced in India, Parsi. And my mother was always Christian. But in the Christian framework, one lives on two temporal planes at once. There's the everyday unfolding plane, and then there's the plane of the eternal, and they are operant at the same time. And I actually think that this does link people living now to people living, say, in medieval Europe under medieval Christian dispensations as well. It's a nonlinear time scheme for sure, and it's not pathologized or judged racially deficient. So it's one of those non-linear time schemes that is not queer. It can be said to be dominant in some respects, especially ones that make you a better capitalist by observing, or deferring pleasures and things like that. So nonetheless, so I think that it can be seen to be a non-linearity that is fully in the spirit of modernity, and it especially was in my household because it was contrasted to a religion that my father found mysterious and incomprehensible, Parsiism. So I think Christianity affords, it is a dominant cultural discourse of nonlinearity. We can think more about that. It has a less dominant arena of a multi-temporality in mysticism. I think psychoanalysis is another discourse in which nonlinearity is fundamental and can be claimed, and I'd be really interested to hear how you are thinking about that, Amnya. And I think that interest in psychoanalytic theory is another way that temporality has become important in queer theory. So my basic understanding of psychoanalysis is pretty rusty, but I do understand that the psyche is itself temporally heterogeneous. Right. So that, as Tim Dean puts it, the time of the ego remains distinct from and perpetually in tension with the temporality of the unconscious. So in the psychoanalytic framework, there is non-linearity kind of built into our psyches. So a couple of points to make. One is that there's nothing intrinsically positive or politically progressive about the condition of multiple temporalities. As I've written about Ernst Bloch's analysis of the Nazis and the ways in the early years they exploited the feeling of being left behind modernity among German youth, a kind of rural peasantry, the petty bourgeoisie as well. And I think that's probably the same thing that's happening now with Donald J. Trump in the U.S. That's my suspicion, is that he is kind of exploiting a certain sense of being left behind by modernity. The other point to make, though, I think, is that linearity and unidirectionality of temporality, of the time's arrow, are not always constraining. And this is something that I've been prompted to think about by Tim Dean, who's written about Hervé Guibert's novel, To the Friend Who Did Not Save My Life, which is a roman à clef written set in mid-'80s Paris about Foucault's and Hervé Guibert's own living and dying of AIDS-related illness. And Guibert writes, and if I can just read a quotation that I think it's really fascinating for the way it suggests that linear time is itself freeing. I mean, one of the things that is a kind of cliche of queer temporal studies is that linear time is bad, right? It's straight time. It's normative. It's a constraint. So here's just a brief quotation from Guibert. Jules, this is a character, once said to me at a time when he didn't believe we were infected that AIDS was a marvelous disease. And it's true that I was discovering something sleek and dazzling in its hideousness. For though it was certainly an inexorable illness, it wasn't immediately catastrophic. It was an illness in stages, a very long flight of steps that led assuredly to death, but whose every step represented a unique apprenticeship. It was a disease that gave death time to live and its victims time to die, time to discover time, and in the end to discover life. If life was nothing but the presentment of death and the constant torture of wondering when the axe would fall, then AIDS, by setting an official limit to our lifespan, 6 years of seropositivity, plus 2 years with AZT in the best of cases, or a few months without it, made us men who were fully conscious of our lives and freed us from our ignorance. So it's kind of fascinating. Guibert's writings suggest that ordinary, linear, chronological temporality can itself open up time to discover life. So Guibert's referring to very specific conditions, but it prompts me to think further about the creative possibilities arising from those oft-deprecated temporal qualities, linearity and unidirectionality. And maybe we can talk more about that. So I think I'll just leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you.